I'm Lisa Stone, and you're listening to Parenting Aces. Welcome to Season 9, Episode 3 of the Parenting Aces Podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Stone, and I have just stepped off of a plane flying from Atlanta back to Southern California, and I'm so excited to bring this week's episode to y'all, but it has just been a crazy week, so I'm a little behind, and I ask your forgiveness in that. I am planning to write an extensive article on my experience with today's podcast guest, but until then, the show notes for this episode are pretty brief. I have included contact information for our guest, Andy Blow, and some links that I highly encourage y'all to click on and read through. But I will be writing a longer piece about my experience going through sweat testing myself and what that was all about and what I found out and how I'm using that information and why I feel like that's so important for today's junior and college players. But for now, like I said, an abbreviated version of the show notes on ParentingAces.com and just a phenomenal conversation with Andy Blow from Precision Hydration about sweat, what we can learn from it, how we can use that information to improve performance, and what we can do if we have a kid who is a salty sweater and as a result is experiencing cramping and other performance issues, I guess, that go along with that. Andy is a former triathlete. He is a phenomenal human being. I had the pleasure of sitting down over coffee with him and his business partners, and I am just so thrilled to bring you this week's episode in light of the fact that we are in the midst of the Australian Open, which is typically a very, very hot slam where we see play suspended for heat, where we see players using ice towels and other methods to try and cool off, and where sadly we often see players having to retire due to the conditions. So I'm excited to bring y'all Andy Blow. Enjoy the episode, and please check back on ParentingAces.com for a more in-depth article on what Andy's doing and how it can help your junior player. Andy Blow, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on, Lisa, and sorry to get you out of bed extra early to do this.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. Thank God for coffee.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I usually start by asking a new guest to give a little bit of their history in tennis, but given that you come from a different background, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about how you became interested in this whole notion of hydration and fluid loss and electrolyte loss in athletes.
Yeah, it's a good job you don't want to ask me about tennis, because I think when I look at a racket, I can assess which end that you've got to hold, who you've got to handle. But beyond that, you don't want to be talking to me about anything more technical when it comes to the actual sport of tennis. But my interest in hydration started many, many years ago when I was training to be a triathlete and trying to get to grips with competing in hot environments sometimes, because where I'm from in the UK, obviously we have some reasonably hot days in the summer on occasion, but we're not famous for our hot weather. And yet the sport of triathlon sort of originated obviously in Southern California and goes on in a lot of nice hot places around the world. And I sort of found out from a fairly young age that if I went to these hot places to race, quite often I would underperform compared to what I would be able to do in the cold. And it took me a very long time to unravel that problem. And really what it came down to was sweat loss, salt loss, and hydration for me. So it was a very sort of personal interest that first got me into it.
And I mean, we hear this term salty sweaters. What does that mean?
Well, basically, when you sweat, obviously your sweat comes from your blood. So your blood plasma, the watery part of your blood, is the reservoir from which sweat is drawn. It moves from your capillaries near the surface of your skin into the sweat glands and then out onto the surface of the skin to evaporate and cool you down. And because blood itself is very, very salty, you lose an element of salt in your sweat. But the body's clever, and because salt is a valuable resource in the body, your body tries to sort of reclaim some of that salt at the sweat gland before the sweat moves onto the skin and evaporates. But the interesting thing is that different people lose salt at different rates. And what I learned through, first of all, through years of trial and error, and eventually through some sort of medical testing, was that I lose a really, really quite high amount of salt in my sweat. So we usually talk about it in milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat. And I would lose about 1.8 grams or 1,800 milligrams per litre of sweat. Whereas we meet other people that only lose 200 or 300 milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat. So there can be a very, very big difference when you look at total sweat and salt loss over a number of hours.
And how does that impact performance? I mean, you talked about the fact that when you were in hot environments, you found that your performance dropped. Why?
For me, a big part of it, and this isn't the case for everyone, but for me, a big part of it was sort of performance of my muscles. Particularly, I would cramp quite a lot, and I would get very sore and stiff muscles, and that would affect. Obviously, that would affect my performance quite dramatically. It also just the salt loss and the fluid loss, if you've got a high sweat rate, affects your cardiovascular performance and your ability to cool down. So you just can feel very sluggish and lethargic and tired, but it's not the same kind of sluggish tiredness that you get from being low on energy or carbohydrates. And often, especially, and I found this as a young athlete, people find it hard to distinguish between the two. I would just describe it as a general kind of feeling of cruddiness and a feeling of malaise when you're in the heat for a long period of time. And when I look back as well, I used to crave salty foods quite a lot, which was kind of my body's way of telling me that I needed some extra salt, but I wasn't quite in tune enough to recognize that might have been the root of the problem at that time.
And it can also affect cognitive ability, right?
Very much so, yeah. One of the bits of feedback that we get from athletes that suffer from severe electrolyte depletion is like a mental fog and concentration slowing down and reactions slowing down. And I think that's one of the interesting areas where it could certainly impact performance in tennis, because although you need an element of coordination and a lot of focus when you're running a marathon at the end of an Ironman triathlon, it's nothing like the level of fine skill that you need when you're playing a long 5 sets or 3 sets of tennis. So
right.
That's where I think that's one of the areas in which it could be interesting for tennis players.
And one of the reasons we decided to do this podcast now is we've got the Australian Open happening in Melbourne, Australia. And well, it's not happening when we're recording this because we're recording this in early December. However, by the time this airs, the Australian Open will be underway. And that particular tournament is known for extreme heat, for developing specific rules around heat and what the athletes can do in terms of taking breaks and taking time to go change clothes and all of those things. So how does the extreme heat in a place like Melbourne, Australia differ from other places, and why do we see these tennis athletes during the Australian Open suffer so extremely there?
I think it's a really interesting question, because performance in the heat, sweating is a big part of performing in the heat. And I think that, so if we go back to kind of a question of like, why do humans sweat? And that's an important one to answer to get to the bottom of this, because we sweat to cool down. This might sound obvious, but we sweat because it's the most effective way in a hot, dry environment of getting heat away from the body. Other animals kind of pant, and other animals have other mechanisms for losing heat, but none of them are really as effective as sweating a lot. So to an extent, the more you can sweat, the better you'll do in the heat. And obviously the harder you're working in a hot environment, the more sweat you lose, the more body heat you can conduct away to the environment, or evaporate away, should I say, to the environment. But the problem comes when you've got athletes that are working really, really hard in tennis in a kind of intermittent sprinting way, and you're generating tons of heat as well as the heat that's coming at you from the external environment. The sweat rates that you produce can be so high that although your body's got to cool you down, it runs into the problem of not being able to take on enough fluid to rehydrate. And then you're in this kind of no-win situation where you're heating up, sweating as much as you can, dehydrating really rapidly, and then unable to keep up that sweat rate and that work rate. So you end up on the floor. And I think, although I'm not a close observer of tennis, I know that from past years, Melbourne have had to adapt the rules at the tournament, and they've had to allow more breaks. And there's always this ongoing debate of, how they can best look after the athletes in that environment. I think the other thing with it is as well is you've got, although tennis players are generally on the circuit and traveling to a lot of hot places, because this is now Northern Hemisphere winter where a number of the athletes will be based, if they haven't had time to go out and really fully acclimatise to the heat before Melbourne, I think that can make it even worse for catching people out.
Right. And in terms of hydration, Andy, I've always been taught to use, pardon my crassness, but the P test and looking at the color of your urine to determine whether you're adequately hydrated. Is that still the accepted way of looking at hydration, or is there something a little more scientific and sophisticated that we should be using?
So it's a really good question. The reality is that the colour of your urine is one of a number of indicators that can show how well hydrated you are or not. But the problem is that in sports science and sports coaching, it's kind of become this gold standard for, it is perceived that it can tell you everything that you need to know about your hydration status. Now, when the theory behind it is that when your kidneys in particular, are trying to conserve water, so when you're becoming dehydrated, your body tends to concentrate your urine and make it give you less urine volume, so it becomes darker in color because there's more waste products visible in it. And that can be a sign that your body's saying, hang on a minute, I need to hold on to more water because I'm losing it at a rapid rate. I'm becoming dehydrated. So I'm going to hold on to it a bit more. Now, sometimes that can be a very strong indicator that you are getting dehydrated. And certainly if when you get up in the morning and you pee, the first pee you do in the day, and it's very dark and concentrated, that's often a reasonably reliable indicator that you are a little bit dehydrated because your body's had time overnight to kind of recalibrate everything. And if you're getting up and your body's peeing very dark, then maybe you are a little bit behind on fluid intake. The problem as you progress into the day is if you look at the colour of your pee when you go to the toilet after you've drunk some things or you've done some exercise, drinking a lot, or drinking especially drinks with caffeine in sometimes, or just doing some exercise, all of these things can affect your fluid balance and hormones in a short-term way that mean that just because you're peeing and it's very clear doesn't mean you're actually well hydrated. It just means that your body thinks it's got to get rid of water. I'm sure you've experienced something like it when you go into a cold environment. Quite often when people go into cold water, or if they just go outside on a very, very cold day, that you need a wee. And that's one example of how the body kind of gets tricked, because when it's cold, your blood volume all goes to the center of the body and your body thinks it's got more blood than it has. So it filters some water out and makes you pee. And so there are definitely cases where, you can drink lots and lots, pee quite a lot, but actually not be fantastically well hydrated because, your body is just dumping water or getting rid of fluid. If people want to read a bit more about that topic, specifically, we've got a very in-depth blog on our website, which I can send you a link to for your show notes, which explains, the times when you're looking at your urine color might be useful and times when maybe it's not so useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll definitely include that link in the show notes and encourage my listeners to have a look at it. I think that's great. One of the kind of pre-tournament guides that we've always been given in terms of making sure our kids are okay out on the courts during a long event is to start hydrating several days before the event. You can't just start the night before. Is that still good advice?
Again, I think it's one of those things which, if taken with a sensible in a sensible context, then yes, you want to be going into an event well hydrated, but humans aren't camels, and we can't store lots and lots of water. So you might, if someone's still got a reasonable training load in the days before an event, you might want to encourage them to drink plenty. But you get to a certain point where if you're just drinking more, all you're going to do is pee. You're just going to wee more out because your body just tries to keep in balance. It's got an optimal sort of level of normal hydration, and you can't really go far beyond that. So I think in the days before, it's a good idea to stay well topped up. But what that doesn't mean is just drinking tons and tons of extra. What you can do, though, in the last sort of 24 hours is drink a couple of extra drinks which have a very, very high salt content or very high sodium content. And what that can do is that can give you a little bit of an extra boost because the sodium helps your body retain that fluid, and then that might top your tanks up a little bit more. And that's certainly something and some advice that we've given to one or two of the pro tennis players that we've worked with before they've gone into what could be potentially long matches in the heat, because that then gives them a little bit of an extra reservoir. And again, we've got a very in-depth blog about, it's called How to Start Hydrated on our website, and it explains the physiology behind that and hopes to hopefully sort of dispel this myth of just pounding lots and lots of extra water before matches, because that can actually be detrimental. If you end up weeing a lot, you end up flushing electrolytes out of your body rather than improving your hydration.
Right. And so that's a great segue to start talking about your company, Precision Hydration, and focusing a little bit more on the actual products that you guys produce and how our young tennis players can use them. So why don't you give us a little bit of the backstory on Precision Hydration, the actual product line, and what it involves?
Well, yeah, as I mentioned with my own experiences as an athlete, I was having these problems in the heat and then trying to unpick why it was. And I thought it might be hydration related, but because of it, I had a high sweat rate and I could feel, on my skin, I was losing a lot of salt. But it wasn't until a doctor friend of mine pointed out that, people lose different amounts of sweat and salt, and that maybe I was on the higher end of the spectrum and I might need a different strategy, that I kind of got on the right track. What I then figured when I'd stopped competing was actually maybe this was extremely useful and valuable information to me. So when I first set up Precision Hydration, the idea was actually not to necessarily produce products and things, but it was kind of education and consultancy with athletes. We used and we still do use a piece of technology from that's taken from the medical world in cystic fibrosis diagnostics, and we can take a sweat sample from someone at rest and we can analyze it and look at the electrolyte concentration and help use that information to help educate on how much electrolyte replacement they might benefit from. So that was kind of how we started out. And then what happened was we were recommending for athletes different levels of electrolyte supplementation in some cases, and just finding that a lot of the common sports drinks that you would find on the market were generally relatively low in electrolytes, often quite high in sugar, and therefore not necessarily the most suitable for people who were sweating lots and lots. They were more of an energy replacement with a little bit of electrolytes rather than the other way around. So what we then did was we developed a range of different electrolyte products, which are either zero sugar or low sugar, but they go up to a very, very high level of electrolytes. So the strongest drink that we do has about 3 times the amount of electrolytes of a regular Gatorade, for example. But that's actually one of our most popular selling products to what I would call, in inverted commas, proper sports people, i.e. people who are sweating a lot every day, because it comes much closer to meeting their needs than a off-the-shelf drink does.
Right. And you guys were really sweet and sent me a package of products that I've been testing out, and I am not a heavy sweater, and I'm living in a place that has relatively low humidity right now in Southern California. So I've been using the 500, the pH 500, but you have a pH 500, a pH 1000, and a pH 1500. Can you explain who should be using each of those and how to determine which is the appropriate one to use at what time?
Sure, yeah. Well, if we start with the lower one, the pH 500 is kind of a similar strength to what the typical sports drinks that you'd find on the market. So quite often,
minus the sugar, right?
Yes, that one's so the one we sent you, if it's the tubes of tablets, then that's a 0 sugar one. And if it's in the packets, then they're about 2% carbohydrate solution, which compared with the 6 or 7% if it's a regular drink. But that one is probably most commonly used by people who are like yourself, maybe just not in an environment where they're going to do tons of sweating. They're probably exercising daily and regularly and pushing it quite hard, because anything, quite often people who are just exercising recreationally are absolutely fine with just water. It's when you start to get to a certain level of sweat output, this can help. But then beyond that, the 1,000 milligram one, the slightly stronger one, that's what we would call kind of like a double strength product. And we find that that's good for a lot of people who are obviously sweating a bit more, who are potentially occasionally prone to muscle cramps or just underperforming in the heat. And then we've got the 1,500, which is the super strong one, and that's the one which you probably understand that we sell a ton of that in places like Florida and Texas, when you've got really extreme heat, really extreme humidity, and where people are really just struggling to keep up with their hydration needs. And on our website, we've got a little online sweat test, it's called, where people can just answer a few questions, and it can help to sort of put them into the right bracket for whether they're likely to need the low, medium or high strength one, and then they can give it a try.
And beyond the online sweat tests that you provide, there are more sophisticated sweat tests out there. What do those sweat tests entail, and how accurate do you feel they are?
So we do a sweat test, which, as I mentioned before, is derived from a medical test for cystic fibrosis. And what that involves is we take a sweat sample from your arm, we stimulate the sweating with a little device that clips on the arm and runs an electric current through a circuit, and it actually causes the sweat glands to produce some sweat. And we can get a sweat sample in 15 or 20 minutes and analyze it on the spot. And that does a very good job of bracketing whether your sweat losses are low, medium, high or very high. There are also kind of more field-based tests that you can do, where you can actually put patches on the body and run around and even play a game of tennis and have those patches collected in and sampled and sent back to a lab, for analysis. So if you want to really go in depth, you can do it that kind of way. There's also, when it comes, and that's looking at sweat concentration. When it comes to looking at sweat rate, there are sort of home done methods that you can use, which involve weighing yourself before and after practice sessions or before and after matches and correcting the difference in weight for the amount of fluid that you've drunk. And that will give you a really good idea on how much sweat you've lost. And again, I keep saying this, but I think it's another good one for people to go to. Is we've got a blog on our website which is all about how to measure your sweat rate, and it gives you a free spreadsheet to download, so you can punch your numbers in if you weigh yourself before and after some hard practice sessions and get an idea of how much you're sweating and work it out for yourself.
So I want to just clarify something, because there is a difference between measuring sweat loss and measuring electrolyte loss, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. So you've got sweat rate, so how much you sweat in terms of liters per hour or fluid ounces per hour, and then you've got the concentration of that sweat. So for me, I have a very high sweat rate. I sweat easily over 2 liters an hour if I'm working out really hard. And I have a very high level of salt in my sweat at 1.8 grams of sodium per liter. So both my total sweat and sodium losses can be really, really high. On the other end of the spectrum, you can have people who have a low sweat rate and a low sodium concentration in their sweat, and they may neither sweat a lot nor lose a lot of salt. So they can be at the other end. But what's interesting about it is that the sweat rate and the sweat concentration are not necessarily entirely linked. So you can have people who sweat a hell of a lot but have very dilute sweat. Mm-hmm. And so they may not be at as much risk as I am, for instance, of having muscle cramps and having problems in the heat, because they find it a little bit easier to keep up with their replacement in terms of electrolytes, at least, because they don't have to supplement as aggressively. So it's a little bit of investigation is needed to kind of figure out where you sit on that spectrum as an individual.
So if you have a kid who is cramping a lot during match play, it could be that they're sweating a lot and they need fluid, but it also could be that their sweat loss is highly salty. I'm using air quotes.
Yeah.
and they don't need necessarily just fluid, but also some sort of electrolyte replacement. And it's important to know, right, whether just drinking water is going to be sufficient or if they need to supplement with some sort of high concentration electrolytes like what you guys produce.
Definitely. It's all about assessing the individual for their needs. There was a really fascinating paper published by a researcher called Michael Bergeron a few years ago, who looked at a case of a young tennis player, 17 years old, who was cramping a lot. And basically, the bottom line with him was they found when they looked at it that he was drinking quite a bit and replacing a lot of his fluid, but he was just not replacing anywhere near enough of his salts, not in his day-to-day diet or in his drinks. And they pointed out, I think, in the paper that one of the troubles that sometimes athletes and parents of athletes have with this concept is that the general health advice for most people is to reduce sodium intake and to reduce salt intake, which is probably quite valid for the average person on the street who is probably over consuming that salt and not exercising enough to sweat a significant amount out. But when you start to get some tennis players, and this young 17-year-old was of a very high standard and was practicing multiple hours every day in the heat, and they worked out that their sort of salt needs were probably 5 or 6 times higher than the daily guidelines were recommending. But when they started to supplement a little bit more, his problems with cramping went away and his performances improved dramatically. And it's all about the fact that it's looking at it through the lens of the individual to get what's right for them. And because I think not just in tennis, but in all sports, we spend a lot of time sometimes looking for what is the answer, to what everyone should be doing. And actually the answer is often extremely individual. What works for one doesn't necessarily work for another. And with salt, it's just really difficult because some people would benefit from reducing it. And I think a lot of athletes would benefit from increasing it. But that kind of goes against the feeling of what is good and healthy, if you were taking standard health advice.
Right. One of the things I find really interesting about cramping is the way that we, the public, look at it. And I found with my own kid that not only was it a physical ailment that needed to be addressed, much like you would address any other physical ailment or injury, but there's also a big psychological component that's tied to it. If you are someone who tends to cramp, I find that there's a lot of mental energy spent waiting for the cramping to come and fearing that the cramping is going to come. And that impedes your ability to perform well as well.
Definitely. It's a big psychological factor because we know that cramping is an issue of the nervous system and the muscle recruitment, all of which is tied into the nervous system and the brain. And we've certainly worked with a few cases of young tennis players where cramping starts to become, it almost starts as a physical phenomenon, but then does end up being a psychological issue alongside it as well. And I think that learning to relax, learning techniques, physical and mental techniques to kind of not focus on that being an issue and to actually can help to mitigate it, as well as, like you say, all the physical interventions like sports massage and potentially acupuncture and stretching and good hydration and electrolyte replacement. All of those things come together and can help to get on top of that problem. It becomes more of a problem when it gets viewed as it must be physical or it must be mental. And actually it's often a combination of the two that need addressing at the same time.
And oftentimes cramping is not something that's a one-off, right? It's,
Definitely.
it can be if you go to some extreme climate, but typically this is something that is an ongoing issue for especially a high-level athlete. Yeah,
we've certainly seen that. Basically, you kind of, I guess you can put people into 3 brackets. One bracket are the fortunate few who just never cramp. And we come across athletes all the time who just never report cramping, no matter what extreme conditions they're in, their body just seems to be able to cope. There's then the large middle group, which is people who might cramp occasionally when they push themselves really, really hard or when the conditions are very severe, but it's not a repeating problem. And then there's that cohort of people who are like problem crampers. And I was definitely one of those as an athlete. And for me, a large part of getting on top of the problem was understanding that I was probably at first making that problem worse by over drinking and under salting. And actually the intervention that worked best for me was increasing my salt intake, but actually decreasing my fluid intake a little bit as well, because I was sort of getting to the point where I was drowning myself in fluid in a bid to stave off the cramps, but actually diluting the electrolytes in my body and making it worse. And so I think sometimes it needs to be stepped back and looked at in those kind of contexts to say, okay, well, because this person is doing something to try and obviously get on top of this long-term problem, is what they're doing helping, or could it actually be hindering the problem?
Mm-hmm. And in addition to taking the online tests that you have on the precisionhydration.com site, how can parents or coaches find labs or places where they can take their young athlete to be evaluated and to determine what the best course of action is?
We've got a growing network of test centres now that offer testing in a whole range of sports. So there's one quite near you in Laguna Beach in Southern California now, where people can go and get tested, and we've got them springing up all over the place. I think we're up to 65 different sites now, and you can find those through our website. The other thing to do, though, there's no sort of one place to go searching, but if anyone is really interested in this and what we're speaking about has piqued their interest, then they can email us at hello@precisionhydration.com, and we can either try and help them find the best resource near to them, or we can certainly do our best in the first instance to try and help them figure things out based on just some feedback and what they've tried, what experiences they've had, because we have a little team in our office of sports scientists and people with background in coaching and nutrition who are there to answer those questions. And what we found is that often the first things that we can try, there's often a lot of low hanging fruit that you can try with someone based on their experiences, and we'd always be happy to field questions and emails from people to help start them off and get them on the right track.
Being a sports and exercise science person yourself, how has that helped you in your athletic pursuits?
I think at first I almost did the two things in parallel. I was studying sports science when I was an athlete and struggling with some of it to relate what I was learning into my own performance. But this was the first area for me where going and doing the scientific investigation and then finding out what the likely issue was and sort of working out an intervention off the back of it was really good. But I think the biggest takeaway for me from what I learned, doing my science degree and the scientific studies, was how to kind of isolate different variables when you're testing things and really try to get to the bottom of what's making a difference to your performance or your recovery. What I see with a lot of athletes is when they're having a problem with something, they'll look at it and they'll maybe try and change 3 or 4 different things at the same time, hoping that will make an improvement. And it's great if it does make an improvement, but often you still then don't really know why it's helped, because you changed 3 or 4 different things. And was it one of them? Was it 2 of them? Was it a combination of them? Or was it all of them that made the difference? And what I've learned from for studying this area a bit more closely is that when we work with an athlete, we really try to break down, okay, is it how much they're drinking that's the issue or not drinking? Is it how much salt they're taking or not? And we try to isolate and change one variable at a time so we can measure the impact of it before we move on. And in that way, you kind of learn in the long run and hopefully then develop long term as a better athlete as a result.
When I told my husband that you were the team sports scientist for a couple of F1 teams, his eyes lit up. So I have to ask you, about your experience working in F1 auto racing, and how did you take your triathlete experience to that job, and what did you learn from that job that helped you now in your role with Precision Hydration?
Yeah, that was a fantastic opportunity that I had when I was younger. I basically took a work placement while I was doing my sports science degree with a Formula One racing team, and they were just setting up a human performance center. So when I look back now, I probably realized that actually what they wanted at the time was cheap labor, and it doesn't come much cheaper than students. So, but what I fell into was a great little team. There was a human performance manager, a physio, a doctor, another sports scientist for a while, and myself. And we really, our job was to try and optimize, the performance and recovery of the drivers that were driving these multi-million-pound Formula One cars. And because none of us were expert in driving, we had the expert in driving sat in the car. We were looking at it from every other angle. So trying to make sure that they were turning up healthy and fit and well prepared and resilient enough to last a full season. So what I got doing that job was a fantastic grounding in all of that multidisciplinary sports science approach of how you need to support an elite athlete. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me was how much of it was actually, I guess, what you would call kind of lifestyle management as much as anything else, because I had all these grand ideas about the exact type of training that we would do to make people fitter, but just making sure that they got to bed on time and ate the right kinds of foods and weren't living with too much stress and things like that were just as important, if not more important, kind of doing those basics right. And I think, what I brought to the job, hopefully, was the fact that I was very passionate about doing my sport, which was triathlon, so swimming, cycling and running. And we had a policy with the drivers that we worked with that whilst we were pretty strict with them doing quite a lot of training, they had to log the hours to stay fit. We were very keen to help them find sports that they were passionate about. So we spent a lot of time mountain biking with some of them who loved that, or running, or rowing, or kayaking, or swimming, or whatever it was, rather than trying to force them to do sports that they weren't so interested in. So trying to help them kind of really find their passion for that. And nowadays I'm still friends with a handful of the drivers that I worked with back then who are now retired from that. So people like the Australian driver Mark Webber and Jensen Button, who now actually lives up the road from you in Malibu. They're still into triathlon and mountain biking and trail running and things like that. And I would hope that some of what we did was sort of light that fire for them and give them a bit of passion for sport outside of it just being simply training.
And for people who don't know, driving a Formula One race car is very physical, right?
Absolutely,
I've watched enough documentaries about it to see, and the amount of sweat loss is tremendous when they're driving because they're in these protective suits so that they don't, if the car catches on fire or the car crashes or whatever, they're in a bubble and protected like an astronaut sort of.
Yeah, no, it's very it is very physical, more physical than people realize. And where we used to have the biggest problems with hydration with the drivers was in places like Malaysia in Asia, where it's extremely hot. You're probably talking about 100 Fahrenheit, 90% humidity. And, they could easily sweat out 2 or 3 liters in the car, maybe even more during the course of a race. And yet they can only drink, 500 or 600 milliliters of fluid at the most. So we used to have to make sure that the guys were well hydrated before they got in the car, but obviously not overdoing it, because the last thing they needed to do is be sat on the line with a full bladder needing a wee.
Right.
That, as we all know, that's bad enough feeling like that when you're driving a road car, let alone something that does 200 miles an hour. So there was a big emphasis on making sure that they were hydrated and set up before they got in the car, and then obviously recovering afterwards, because these guys had such a schedule. They would often finish the race on Sunday afternoon, go to the award ceremony if they need to do that, and then they'd be on a plane that evening on a long haul flight. And long haul flying is just rough on the body anyway, especially from a hydration perspective. So just making sure they had a process to follow and they stayed on top of it was very, very important to keep them healthy.
And that's exactly the life of a high-level tennis player as well. Yeah. You finish a tournament, hopefully on the last day, because you've made it to the finals, and then you're immediately off to the next event. And so that whole process of recovery is crucial. I think it's so interesting hearing you talk about how important the overall lifestyle was when you were working with the Formula One racers. And that is something that we talk about a lot with young athletes as well in tennis, the importance of sleep, the importance of stress management, the importance of eating well, drinking well, obviously, to overall performance. And we oftentimes ignore those other pieces of the puzzle, but they can make or break an athlete in terms of performance.
Oh, I think most commonly at the high level, that is what makes and breaks the athletes from what I've seen, because at a high level, once you get to a certain level, the difference in talent and skill and all the rest of it is often pretty small, really. So it's the little edges that count. And those edges often don't come from being particularly a lot better than someone else. It becomes from making less mistakes or being more consistent or whatever. And consistency and those sort of things all come through, like you mentioned, I think one of the biggest ones is sleep. If I could go back and tell the younger me one way that I could have improved my performance, it would have been to take a better attitude towards sleep.
Interesting.
Nowadays, I've got 2 young kids, and I've been through a phase with them where it's been challenging getting enough sleep. And I monitor my heart rate variability most mornings to keep tabs on, just how I am generally out of interest. And it tends to tell me when I'm getting sick, or if it tends to tell me if I'm kind of overcooking it a bit. And what I notice is that the biggest correlator for me with getting a nice high stable heart rate variability where I feel relaxed and everything is getting to bed early. If I can get to bed early, then I can soak up a lot more stress, whether it's work, kids, training, everything else that's going on. But when you take away that sleep, and everything else starts to, it's sort of the foundation on which a lot of other things start to crumble. And I learned that a lot recently as well through long haul flying, like flying from UK to the west coast of America. And then I get disrupted sleep for 3 nights. And by day 4, I'm on my knees.
Right.
I've got to slow down. So I try and build in a little bit more R&R time and try and adapt to the time zones a bit better when I travel now. And I think like you've pointed out with tennis players, that's critical, because if they're at a high level, they are traveling all the time. The other thing that I think is fascinating and also really difficult to deal with tennis is the fact that you genuinely don't know how long each game is going to be, let alone how long each tournament's going to last.
Exactly.
And sort of, at least when we're dealing with a marathon runner or a triathlete, that you turn up and the marathon is going to be 26.2 miles. And you can, if you're any good, you can probably calibrate your expected finish time within plus or minus 3 minutes, so you know what the task is all about. There are variables, but they're pretty controlled. With tennis, you could be here in there today and gone tomorrow, or you could be playing 5 sets a day for numerous days. And I definitely think that's a really interesting area that I would love to learn more about, actually working with more and more tennis players over time.
Interesting. Well, Andy, this has been fascinating and eye-opening, and you've kind of debunked some of the information that I've had my whole life regarding hydration and making sure that I'm doing the right things for my body, much less for an elite athlete. Is there anything else you would like us to know before we wind things up here?
No, I think I would just love people to hit our website and go to the blog section. It's keyword searchable, and if they've got questions about hydration, to type them into there. And if they're not getting good answers coming up in our blog articles, then email us at hello@precisionhydration.com. Although we are a company that sells services and products, fundamentally we've got a real passion for educating people about figuring out the hydration puzzle for them. So if that is what I would love people to do, is sort of, if any of what we've talked about has piqued their interest, they should get in touch, and then we can have a conversation about what they might need to be doing to perform at their best.
Fantastic. Well, Andy Blow, thank you so much for joining us on the Parenting Aces podcast. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I look forward to digging a little deeper into your website myself. And to my listeners, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time on Parenting Aces. I'm Lisa Stone, and you've been listening to the Parenting Aces Podcast. For tennis parents, by a tennis parent. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to us and write a review on iTunes. For more information on navigating the junior and college tennis journey, please visit us online at ParentingAces.com. Thanks for tuning in and sharing us with your tennis community.